I'm really pleased I'm able to build on the foundations of the terrific talk we've just heard from Gavin. And I was thinking about how that might come together when I took my wife to the eye clinic at the Western Eye Hospital last Saturday morning, because we thought we'd have to have a very long wait. Turned out that there were only about 30 people in this A&E for eye issues. And there was diverse demography, people from many different countries coming to London to live in peace and harmony over what? A very long wait. It says 2 to 3 hours wait. So don't people get upset about that? Well, actually, this was the sign that they had in the hospital. All patients will be seen according to their clinical condition, not arrival time. And it struck me that that's precisely the issue that we face in, if I may be pessimistic, a flat level of resources and a rising level of demand. Now, if we say first come, first serve, which I'd say more or less a lot of parts of British policing are essentially operating on a first come, first serve principle, dispatching the major part of resource, which then may also involve not having enough dispatchers. But all of this gets back to the question of why we try to exceed the physical reality of trying to make supply match demand when the demand is just growing relentlessly and the supply of revenue, in any case, is not. And it strikes me that what we need throughout all of this discussion, not just with the complexities of governance, but with the sense of fairness among the British people. And incidentally, that includes me, because I got a citizenship in this wonderful country. For somebody who started out in the NYPD, that's probably a fairly unusual thing. It shows you how much I love the country and love my British wife and love lots of things. But I don't like being forced to square a circle or to try to match supply with this relentless growth in demand. And as one Norwich MP says, policing by consent is now at risk because of this irreconcilable relationship between supply and demand. But I would say that actually consent, policing by consent is always at risk in a democracy, or indeed, to go back to the 17th century, government by consent is something that governments have to earn daily, and especially as demands change. Now, if we go back to 1829, when Edwin Chadwick actually wrote the Peel Principles about policing by consent, what were they asking the public to consent to? They were asking the public to accept the fact that there's going to be people patrolling the streets. They're not going to respond to things except the things they see, like stop thief. And there will be substantial public order events. And 4 years into the Met, we had 3 of them stabbed in the Cold Bath Fields riot, and 1 of them killed. And that is still, sadly, with 26 officers attacked and seriously injured over the protests on Saturday, still the case here that the policing by consent in some ways sets up an opportunity for angry people to confront their government physically in the form of a police officer. But most of the things that we have to worry about outside of the ongoing challenge to public order, not only in this country, but around the democratic world, what we have at the moment, I think, is the policing by consent in relation to this conception that there's a bottomless pit for dispatching, that you call 999 and the police need to come. That wasn't Robert Peel's problem. We didn't have Ocado either. We didn't deliver anything to people's houses in those days as a government service. But what do we need to ask people to consent to in order to deal with the balance of supply and demand? And I think if we dissect the current relationship between consenting to have policing, there's lots of consensus around, yes, we want rapid response. Yes, we want every crime investigated, including non-crime hate incidents. Yes, we want arrests at the scene. We get thinner consent when we start talking about the things that we have from some very substantial evidence can save lives, like stop and search, like live facial recognition, like speed cameras. But it's still majority support, so democratically speaking, it's a really great thing to do. Our problem is not those things. Our problem is supply and demand are out of kilter. And so the consent we need is to have somebody say, yes, we consent to your not doing something. It's the tail wagging the dog of 999, always trying to drag the dog of police response here, there, and everywhere without a unifying principle. What is the principle for allocating scarce resources? And this is the issue that Ike Eisenhower dealt with for 4 years while he was planning the invasion of Europe. And people like Winston Churchill actually wanted to divert him into an invasion of Italy, and he said, no, we're sticking with France. He came up with this idea of the Eisenhower matrix of things that are urgent, but they're not important. Things that are important, but may not be urgent. And of course, things that are neither or both. And to think about the demand on police services from the standpoint of the Eisenhower box, I think is a useful exercise, if only because when you explain it to groups outside of the governmental decision elite and try to pervade the entire country with an understanding of choices that have to be made, because we can't have it all just because we have a phone that can dial 999. If we go back to Steve Jobs, he is often cited for talking about how important it is to figure out what not to do, and how Apple became a great company and indeed changed our lives by saying no to 1,000 things a week to make sure we don't get off on the wrong track or try to do too much. When was the last time anybody said the police are trying to do too much? Well, they might not like a particular device like live facial recognition. But the question of policing by consent with precision and using the digital revolution to identify with great accuracy the most dangerous threats to communities, even at the price of not dealing with much lower levels of threat, which may have much higher volume and may be visible to more people, but the threat itself is pretty invisible and doesn't get the attention it deserves without the precision that we need. So in effect, what we're trying to look at is how do you say no to a population that is hooked on instant response from policing with a 10-second answering of the phone standard that is something I have seen in no other sector in business or other societies. The idea of having clear facts about evidence-based policing in the digital age can bring us to a starting point of asking, well, at present, how many 999 calls are we deflecting? I bet it's quite a few already, and the basis for doing that is a mix of policies and principles. The rules are changing, of course, in things like right care, right person, but the demand for response too often leads to, we'll try to get you there an officer as soon as possible. We can go with appointment policing. We can do other things. But as I've worked with police forces around the country for the last 20 years, it is remarkable how many places have a 24-hour average to respond for certain calls. And a good half or more of them keep having the dispatcher calling back saying, not going to get there right now, how about a couple hours from now, and so forth. And eventually, it doesn't get a response anyway, which may read back to the question of should we take large categories, like 2 officers staying 12 hours waiting for a psychiatrist to show up and decide whether or not to certify a mentally disturbed person. The great thing about right care, right person is that it gives us a model for how to police by consent with a decision to say, no, we're not going to do that. And if we take the wide consultation that Humberside first did and then came down and told us at the Met all about it, I think it was an excellent example of trying to treat the public in general, it's a big, tall order, but to speak broadly and full of detail about why we have to say no to doing something that we've been doing for a long time, and how everybody's going to be better off. It's not the best use of police resources to have 2 officers for 12 hours with somebody just because you can't get a psychiatrist to the scene. It's also better for the people in need if they have people who are more specialized for working with them than police. And of course, we get huge savings in police time. But what else and who else can we look to as a decision to deflect the calls? I think the reality is that many call takers are doing it. Some officers may respond and decide to go on to something else because they're all making judgments around certain kinds of principles about whether they should be doing this now or something else. And any police leader who might, even in the neighborhood level, might decide not that one, but this one will get our priority. Where are we in terms of a principle that we can articulate in making that decision? Aren't all people created equal, as Thomas Jefferson, the slave owner, wrote for the independence of the U.S. from this country? Well, yes and no. People as persons are all equally important under the law, but the problems, crimes, disturbances, and other things that we have are not created equal. They are highly unequal. And with digital tools, we can now discriminate. Not in the way that the current battle is being won right now, with the people being rewarded for having the squeakiest wheel and getting the most resources. Advocacy groups, for one, are those that insist on having vast amounts of police time drained by the most current example, and perhaps the biggest example, is filling out dash reports on 1 million domestic contacts a year, with no financial analysis of how much that costs, or indeed what benefit is being achieved by making police officers do that in a way that I think is comfortable actually to many of us in policing, but not optimal, as the Daily Telegraph campaign last month showed, with dozens of women being murdered after police were relying on this deeply flawed domestic violence tool. And the demand for an urgent review of the DASH or DARA checklist following these deaths led the safeguarding minister, Jess Phillips, to state that domestic violence tools aren't working the way they should. And we see that the predictive capacity, the predictive precision and accuracy of having those tools used in domestic abuse, because in a larger political context, we have the lobby to do that, but we didn't have the lobby to do that with the released prisoners and the early release of prisoners, which is going to become a huge issue on the streets of our police forces and cities. And when I think about the tragedy that Cambridge University had with a terrorist who was let out early on his sentence because he had been well behaved in prison, and he attended an event that Cambridge University organized in London, and he managed to kill 2 of our students in the process before he was shot to death by City of London police. Why was he allowed to go to London to attend this event? Well, I would say he probably would not have been allowed to attend had there been a proper digitally based risk assessment that would tell us not only what his risk was, but the 200 or more, depending on how far back you go. These terrorist offense convicts appear to me to have a far higher risk of committing murder when they get out of prison than normal, or shall we say non-terrorist offense convicts have been. And there has been no development of digital tools that actually govern the exit decisions, the early releases, and all these other options we have to hold people back without getting any new legal rulings about their case, but simply within the discretion of Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service. And I've been in discussions with them for about 2 years, and even earlier in doing the kind of statistical prediction models that would readily distinguish not only the most dangerous people coming out of prison, but also the most dangerous people involved in domestic abuse cases. Not in ways that rely on professional judgment, but in ways that rely on huge digital databases. We don't forecast weather by professional judgment, except hour by hour, but certainly not a statement that in 3 days the winds are going to be very high, as they are today. We rely on incredible amounts of data from now many, many weather satellites, and all of the data is aggregated. And that's the kind of thing that the prison service can do. That's the kind of thing that the police service can do if we become committed to using the data that we have. And yes, it raises another budget issue, but actually it's not that expensive. And I'm going to give you the example we developed at the Met, which was in a form of an Excel spreadsheet, pretty straightforward to calculate. But the point is to take that seriously as something that you get from 100,000 people, as opposed to having individuals rely on their experience with maybe hundreds of people, which can't get you to the rare events and the most dangerous people. So here we have the commissioner speaking to the new Home Secretary on her first day in office on a Saturday morning, in which she is definitely talking about the management of demand in relation to the non-crime hate incidents. And I think Mark's reference to a well-understood concept, which is a rock and a hard place, that the laws and the changing world since 1986, when you had a police attention put on people making threats or other conversation face-to-face in a public place, and that gets mapped onto social media, and all of a sudden you see, just through the normal working of systems, 5 armed officers at Heathrow meeting somebody because of what they wrote in a digital post. So what the phrase of policing the streets, not the tweets, changing the law, getting out from the rock and a hard place, that's more generally a problem than that, and that's a pretty big problem as it is. But what I want to stress is that I'm so glad that the United Kingdom is not America. I'm so glad that this is not a country in which the mayor of London is going to order the police commissioner of Scotland Yard to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu because there is a warrant from the ICC, never mind the fact that the US doesn't even subscribe to the Convention for the International Criminal Court. What's more important is you don't want an elected official giving an order to a police commander to make an arrest. And that's never been possible in this country since 1361, if we follow the historians of operational independence. And yet we still have this competing view over the Atlantic that President Trump is trying to become the police chief of America. The irony of the picture I happened to select for you was his being arrested on some 33 charges in 2023, as opposed to walking with not just uniformed officers, but ICE officers wearing masks. I believe in the history of British policing, we've never had any units assigned to wear masks for foot patrol on the streets or other kinds of public encounters. Why am I making this wonderful point about the UK is not America? And the reason is that policing is an independent profession with independent operational decision-making in a way that politically driven police forces in the United States, in Latin America, in many other places allow. And the operational independence of policing under the rule of law goes back to a nice, clear, straightforward principle, which is that the laws should only be enforced if they promote the king's peace. Making an arrest, making a prosecution, just because there has been evidence of lawbreaking is not sufficient, especially if it causes bloodshed, upheaval, conflict, and a failure to keep the peace in an era before communications, in an era in which the magistrates were operating as modern police do, to make these discretionary decisions about when to impose the force of law and when not to. But when we impose that law in the context of you don't have to, you can make a decision to do the right thing, now we come back to a kind of consenting to know that no citizen can tell a police officer or police force that they have to make an arrest, and no elected official can tell them that. And so now we have to go back to the question of why do we do policing sometimes and not others? And just as the King's Peace came out of that history, so did the King James Bible put into English in a very clear way something that was in the Acts of the Apostles in Book 4 and translated in the King James Bible as we give these things out to each according to their need. Kind of like we give you attention in the eye clinic depending on how bad your eye condition is. If you're going to lose your eyesight if we don't attend to you right away, then we're going to attend to you and let other people, like my wife's contact lens problem, wait until the ones who have greater need. So this idea of need and allocating policing based on who needs it most, where and when policing is needed most, and allowing the overall model to make that accommodation so that we're not devoting all of our time to the tail wagging the dog so we don't have the resources. I mean, in extreme circumstances like the Nottingham police truck that drove past me Saturday morning on the way to the EDL protest and the wonderful interoperability and mutual aid systems in this country, we can do that for these massive public order cases. But there's more to policing than public order. There's all sorts of issues that cause us to reflect on the preference for distributing policing as well as food for the hungry to those who have the greatest need. And if we look at what the possible precision metrics for digital record keeping might be for policing, we can see that metrics like volume crime could be a principle, and so we put the most response to what I heard somebody say in the preceding sessions, in the questions, the things that people are most concerned about. Well, the things that people are most concerned about may not be the greatest need that needs to be addressed by the professional judgment of experienced police officers. One thing that's very hard to work with is yield or solvability. If you invest a lot of time into investigating male-on-male crimes in Kent, for example, you will find that most of the time you'll get nowhere. But if you take away the vast majority of them in which the victim doesn't want to cooperate, your solvability will go way up. So Kent has saved millions by making solvability the factor that determines whether or not that kind of minor ABH even cases go forward. And it's a good example, but it's not as good, in my view, as something so simple that everybody gets it, and that is how much harm, a measure of pain, how much harm is the police action preventing in a very precise metric that can be derived from the sentencing guidelines, which actually are determined at the Royal Courts of Justice, which is why I have their picture there. And in 2016, some of you know, the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, Peter Nehru and I, and Eleanor, who was finishing her PhD at the time, wrote something that's now been read over 110,000 times, and I'm happy to say is increasingly being used, not only in the Cambridge form, but also in the Office of National Statistics form of the crime severity scores, which are taken from the average sentences that each offense category gets. There's only a couple hundred of those. We have, for the sentencing guidelines, almost 800 of them. So I don't want to get into who's got the better index. I don't care, actually, if everybody used the crime severity scores. we'd be so much better off because we'd have that precision. We'd have a way of saying that this person has caused more harm than that person, according to the victims who are alleging that abuse. And even in Nottingham, sure, you can look at the yellow line here in 2016 to see that the harm level was going up very rapidly, even while the blue line, which is the counts of the number of criminal events, was remaining flat. It's interesting that according to that version of a score, there was so much correlation starting in 2010 and going forward. But then when it splits, when the crimes that you're getting are becoming more severe, you want to pay attention. And as I advised the government before they got elected, if you're going to promise to cut both knife crime and VOG crime in half, you better be doing that based on harm levels, as opposed to each incident is created equal, which it certainly isn't. And so a knife crime might involve waving a knife at somebody, or it might involve stabbing 10 people to death. And depending on how we count this, we would then shape police priorities. So I think it's vitally important, and indeed to some degree negligent, that the definition of cutting knife crime, cutting VOG crime in half has not been clear about what the metric is. And that's where I think there's a role for the police profession to speak out, to say, look, if we're going to have this goal, and we want to be serious about it because we'd like to help those who are in greatest need to have VOG crime prevented, to have knife crime prevented, then what we want to have is a clearly defined, auditable tracking of what the numbers actually show, lest we drift over to a country where the cities that the president wants to take over policing in, where homicides dropped in half or more, and he says they're out of control, they're the worst they've ever been, because he can invent all his numbers and it doesn't matter. Well, there is no accountability to a president who makes up numbers because his followers love him no matter what he says. But there is accountability in this country to the reliance on the official statistics, which the news media would strongly support, and which I think give us the opportunity to use the crime harm index to create priorities with precision for budget allocations, for allocating which calls get a response and which ones don't, the crimes that are things that probably won't get much attention, all of which is currently happening in some degree by virtue of keeping it under the radar, bike theft, shoplifting, et cetera. And then they come up to the level of dialogue in a way that I think makes it safer for policing to be the source of the facts, to supply the data that democracy needs to understand the diversity of harm, that some things the police do can prevent huge amounts of harm, that a lot of the things you want the police to do are not going to have much effect in preventing that harm from occurring. So I know that we've had lots of solutions in the past that have really gone over very badly with the public of top slicing. We won't investigate any shoplifting under 100 pounds. I heard that 10 years ago from some of our students from large police forces in this country. Petrol station drive-offs. There's just too many of them. We can't track them down, especially if you don't take pictures of them. So we're not going to investigate those. Or bike thefts from station racks, where we have many, many thousands of people who are angry that they can't get the police to pay any attention to their bike theft in station racks. But all of those things can be enforced intermittently. And to some extent, we can't do everything for everybody, but we can do something about everything on an unpredictable and haphazard basis, by surprise, rotating across types. Bernard Hogan Howe sort of indicated that when he talked about total policing as being intermittent. And he even talked about the crime of the week, which I think is probably too transparent, because then you notice that at the end of the 7 days, like the tube strike, you're going to go back to committing your bike thefts. But if you're catching suspects in the act, putting the videos out on social media, raising deterrence by prevention, But with under 1% of the offenses being detected, you can do something for everything while you still invest more in the highest harm prevention that could be achieved by public consent, by explaining to people that why we need to put more police time into this and less into that is exactly the numbers we're going to show you in the case study that Mark Rowley has developed with the top 100 most dangerous offenders in London, I think has been a successful case in point in which we ranked the high harm targets based upon victims accusing suspects of specific offenses that had sentencing guidelines attached to them, and the number of days of imprisonment recommended for that particular offense, which becomes the starting point for the sentencing, those days become a score for, and there we go, thank you. Those days become a score by which we can rank order these people in the top 100. Now, Mark asked the right question, and then the answer that came back was that we can calculate this not so much with pre-crime predictions, just because the data systems weren't well enough financed to allow that, but we can go retrospectively to see of everybody who was accused, not necessarily arrested or charged, but just accused by victims of two independent offenses over the past 365 days, and what we get is this. We get all these people whose height depends on the number of days that they would be sentenced to prison if the sentencing guideline starting point was applied to the offenses that they were accused of committing by victims. So this is not a gangs violence matrix. It's not something that police come up with through qualitative intelligence. This is precise digital intelligence in which the precision derives from the number of days of punishment associated with each offense, and then for every offense you have, it adds up to more and more and more. So what you see here with the arrow, which is really important, is the top 100. And that top 100 begins at about 3,000 days of imprisonment. We're looking at close to 10 years of imprisonment as the sentencing guideline starting point for attempted rape, attempted murder, in some cases murder. They're all in that top 100 out of the 35,000 suspects who qualify. And the median, the midpoint of all of these people with 2 or more offenses is 11. So if you get up to the top of the top 100, you're looking at people who are 1,000 times more harmful, according to their victims, than the median offender who is accused by victims of vogue crime. So on the one hand, we have a history of dealing with vogue, going back to Theresa May saying every domestic violence case is a potential murder. And what that does is to force us to spread our resources so thinly that they make almost no difference. And that's the growing conclusion about DASH, which is a spreading of resources across all of these calls without any clear benefit. V100 is the opposite. It says, let us create the 12 proactive teams in the basic command unions of the metropolitan units of the Metropolitan Police, and have the time and effort put into really, really bad people and see what happens. So is there any question of clarification about what that scale means, and indeed how it could be computed for offenders, in this example, potential victims, potentially places? It's about being precise in deciding what you're going to do, which then has implications for what you're not going to do. And if we look at what the Met did with these people, we can say the first of all the intelligence teams checked to see if they were in prison. About 15% of them were. where they were last located. Do we have existing warrants or even electronic tagging on them? Are there license conditions that they can be barred from locations? Do we have co-offenders and prior arrests or past victims we can track down to try to get them? And then when we consulted with the victims, some of whom had withdrawn cooperation, we were able to get them to change their story and to give a statement to the police, to provide evidence, to lock them up. And we put some people in prison for 10 years by getting a non-cooperative victim who was sympathetic to other women, didn't know that the average offender in this top 100 has 4 separate victims. So they don't know each other, but the police can tell them that this person has been accused by other victims. Will you help us get this person behind bars? And we've now convicted over 100 of those offenders who get, of course, new additions every month. And what the police were doing initially amounted to doubling the risk of arrest, with 148% rise in the arrest rate for every 100 days free. We had an 80% increase in criminal charges. When you have the resources, you can go after the really, really bad people. And when you have the precision to identify them, you can be very comfortable that you are focusing in the right place. So when the stuff about Dash came out, my colleague and full disclosure, my wife, Heather Strang, was on Times Radio with Jane Garvey, formerly of Women's Hour, and she said, well, if Dash doesn't work, are there any alternatives? And she said, well, yes, you could have an instant lookup for the VOG 100. Not just the 100, but maybe the top 10,000 out of the 35,000 to see where the score is. And rather than taking half an hour to ask victims a lot of questions for a survey that doesn't have reliable predictive validity, we could go right to the victim's ranking. And that set off lots of conversations. I hope my telling you about it will set off some conversations. Perhaps you may even want to consider whether there should be more proactive investment in these sexual risk orders, which have been available since 2022. I had the pleasure of telling the former president of the UK Supreme Court that actually if you have 3 or more independent victims saying that there has been sexual crimes committed against them, without each case having, or any of those cases having the burden of proof beyond a shadow of a doubt, but rather the civil standard of a balance of probabilities because you're getting independent victims saying the same thing, the magistrates can impose a civil order called sexual risk order, and if they break the terms of the civil order, then it's a crime, and they can go to prison for that. What are the terms of the order? Well, they have to notify police before they have sex, or if they've had sex, they have to tell the police the next day, and if they don't, then they can go to prison. There's a standing search warrant. The police are allowed into their house 24/7. There are all these other onerous things that, no surprise, when I show you that Detective Inspector Dan Whitten, now a homicide detective at the Met, showed that the average harm per month for these people before they got a sexual risk order was on the left. It was huge. With the risk order, it had an enormous prevention value, just judging by what victims were telling the police. So the average sexual harm per month went from 50 before the SRO, went from 18 down to about 3. And the trend line with them also showed a severe impact of having the SRO. So this is something you can't do unless you have a specialized unit doing it. And if we don't have a specialized unit, does that mean we ignore this tool? Or do we want to try to combat the terrible high harm crimes, sex crimes committed by these people with this kind of evaluation that I won't bore you with at the moment? It's not quite a controlled experiment. It's very close to it. And we have some, incidentally, some very good news to report soon, but I won't get ahead of Mark Rowley's telling the world that it's a very important option to consider, but it can only be considered if you have the resources to do it. And you're not going to get new money to do it, so what do you stop doing in order to do this kind of thing? In victims, Gavin Dudfield, your fellow member of this association, when he had a lower rank, was able to show that in Dorset, over a one-year period, less than 4% of the victims suffered 85% of the harm. And as James Vaughan will tell you, that led them to reorganize the way that they were focusing investigations proactively, and they started looking down the rank order of victims by harm and discovered things like elderly people being cuckooed by the county lines gangs, and that allowed them to go right to the location, actually make arrests on the gangs. This kind of precision digital analysis is a useful way to decide what to do in policing and to justify to the public in a process of transparent explanation the idea of not doing other things so that you could be working on these things. Nothing speaks more than that, I think, in the map that you're seeing in London, in which the commissioner tried to tell a morning radio host that 2/3 of London over a 2-year period did not have a single knife crime. And the outrage, the violation of conventional expectation. What do you mean? Knife crimes all over London, we know that. And in fact, 100% of the knife crime is reported over a 2-year period, just in about 33%, with massive concentration in under 5%, having over half of the knife crime harm. Again, calculated through sentencing guidelines by our digital analysts at New Scotland Yard. If we wanted to cut knife crime in half, the most evidence-based way to do it is not to have any resources devoted to it outside of those red dots, which had the highest levels of knife crime harm, or the blue dots, which were in the secondary range, and certainly not in any of the white areas. If we were to map, stop, and search, unfortunately, it wouldn't be nearly correlated. It would be spread out for lots of legal reasons. But in an ongoing conversation about Section 60, I think there's still a lot to be said, and could be said, for empowering police to use Section 60s in places that have had consistent, repetitive knife crimes at those locations. And remember, this is 15,000 small spots called hexagons is what London Metropolitan Police Area has been divided up into, with this kind of distribution that would look like that, just like for the high harm offenders, if we map the places, if we map the victims, and we map the suspects. So what I would say is maybe we need to back up in the first principle to say maybe 50% of police budgeting should go to crime prevention by metrics of crime harm. That half of all the police resources can take work that doesn't need to be done by the other half, the reactive half, the response cars, the investigations, the arrests, the prosecutions. If the crimes don't happen in the first place, they don't have to do all of that. And if we can prevent crime by tracking the digital measurement of crime in a way that shows that we are making better use of police time to prevent, then what we're getting is a power few concentration. And so if I could just close with this idea, which has been around in social science for over 100 years, from a discovery by an economist named Pareto. The idea that over half of your problem or your wealth or anything else comes from a tiny fraction of the population is a strategic insight that can be used to help police wellness. And the company I now am associated with for 8 years has studied over 200,000 police officers in 2,000 participating police forces to develop a strategy of predicting which officers are most likely to be injured, which officers are most likely to do self-harm, which officers are most likely to be charged with sexual misconduct. We have tools of digital forecasting in relation to the welfare of officers and ways to prevent their having more serious problems as something that can be mapped onto this same notion that rather than spreading a blanket over a whole haystack, that we can go looking for the needles. And when we find the needles, a lot fewer people are going to suffer. So the final point of police wellness is that we can prevent harm to public safety officers as well as by public safety officers. And we're already talking with several forces represented in the room. I just want to make this high-level generality point that if we talk about harm and trying to help in the biblical sense those who most need help in relation to the prevention of that harm, then we will have a different kind of dialogue with the public, and I am confident that we could do that kind of policing by consent. Thank you very much.